These are your visual notes for Darwin's theory of natural selection, his explanation for evolution. So remember, evolution is the observation, it's the fact that things change over time, that species change over time. And the explanation for it, the theory for it, is technically natural selection. So let's look at natural selection in more detail. There are four main components of this that you need to be familiar with. Genetic variation, organisms are genetically different from each other, even in the same species. Overproduction of offspring and a struggle for existence, so competition. Survival of the good enough. We're not going to say survival of the fittest because the word fittest is not a very good term. We'll talk more about that in a second. And descent with modification. So here we go. The first is genetic variation. So variation is a difference in traits, naturally exists in all populations. I mean, think about it. If the chances of every living thing ever being identical to each other genetically, all the billions and billions of base pairs, what are the chances that they're all identical to each other, even if we're just looking within humans? The answer is basically zero unless you have an identical twin. And even if you have an identical twin, you accumulate mutations differently across your individual lives. So variation is the norm, and it is the raw material for natural selection. Natural selection does not generate, it does not create variation. It punishes it. And this is a key concept here. You want to write this down. Genetic variation is pretty much almost always due to mutations. Some crossing over, but mutations is the big one. That's how you generate genetic diversity. Natural selection does not do that. Natural selection punishes differences. If we want to think about it this way, if there are differences in a population and some differences are not very well suited for the environment, natural selection will remove those alleles. It will punish those genes via reduced reproductive success in the individuals carrying those genes. So natural selection punishes and reduces genetic variation, whereas mutations generate it. We'll talk more about, it's not necessarily the fittest or the best. You don't have to be the absolute best at something. You don't have to be the squirrel with the bushiest tail. You just have to have a decent enough tail and a decent enough fur of coat to make it through the winter. So that's why we call it survival of the good enough. Bill Nye is actually one of the people who kind of pioneered using that term, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And again, those that make offspring that reproduce are the individuals that matter most. It's not just good enough to survive in the world of, well, in reality and in evolution, it's all about passing on your genes to your offspring and so on and so on. So again, here are the sources of variation. Mutations are the biggest one by far and away. You also have gene shuffling, crossing over. These happen during meiosis. Here's a diagram of crossing over right here. And random mating, which we'll encounter this unit too, also increases genetic variation. It's not a terribly common thing to see, and you don't really actually see this in a lot of animal species. You usually see this in aquatic species like sea urchins or fish. But random mating does this too. Random mating is where basically any other individual has an equal chance of reproducing with you. With humans, we're kind of picky and choosy, and that's true for a lot of organisms. Some more terms that you should be familiar with. The gene pool is all of the genes in a population. So all of the alleles for a trait are referred to as the gene pool. And again, evolution is another way to think about it, is the change in the gene pool frequencies over time. The change or the change in the abundance of alleles or frequencies over time. That's really all evolution is. The change in allele frequencies. I'll even say this. we'll add it in here, allele frequencies over time, right? High genetic variation is typically a good thing for populations. If there are environmental hazards or viruses or bacterial infections and the response, the immune response is partly genetically determined, it's better to have a variety of responses. If one individual gets sick, they're probably all going to get sick. So genetic variation is, or diversity is typically a good thing. If you have low diversity, low genetic variation, something in the environment that kind of does one organism in is likely to do them all in. So you are more susceptible to diseases. This is especially true for animals like the cheetah, or any organism that we bring back from being endangered. They typically have very, very low genetic variation, and we're concerned about that because one environmental insult, one virus that comes through that population or something like that can be enough to just do it all in, to make it go extinct. Inbreeding also decreases genetic diversity. There is a natural aversion to inbreeding. People, amongst people in particular, that the idea of inbreeding is not a very popular one, but there's an evolutionary reason for that. It's because inbreeding is almost always detrimental to the individuals who are the result of it, but also to the health of the species overall. So what you're going to notice is that a lot of your attitudes towards things or your behaviors towards things only start to make sense in light of evolution. And one of those things is a disgust towards inbreeding. It's a universal human trait across cultures, across time, and across civilizations. We talked about this earlier, but artificial selection is when humans do the picking, right? So humans do the picking for artificial selection for things like dogs, right? Nature, or natural selection, basically picks everything else. Every other organism that you see pretty much on this planet is the result of natural selection. For the most part, it's just the things that we eat, the things that we consume, the type of wheat, the type of soybean, the type of corn, the type of grasses. All of those things have been artificially selected by people over the past 10,000 or so years. You're not going to go out in nature and just find the type of corn you would eat for dinner. That is an artificially selected species, pretty much just like everything else you eat. But that's the key difference. Artificial is when humans do the selecting, the picking, and natural selection is what Darwin talked about, when nature does the picking. All right, so if 10,000 years can get us all of these breeds of dogs, what can evolution do over billions of years? This is from Cosmos. If any of you have ever watched Cosmos, the answer is all the beauty and diversity of life on Earth. All right, struggle for existence, competition. This is intuitive, right? There is not enough resources for everyone, for all the individuals, so they compete with each other, right? There's a struggle for existence. Predator-prey relationships advertise this very well. But remember that there's a cost, right? There's a cost to developing these huge claws or strong muscles and fast twitch muscle fibers and all that kind of stuff, sharp teeth, right? Building traits, building phenotypes takes energy, and you can't have infinitely sharp claws or infinitely fast legs or things like that. So there is an upper limit. But these, well, in the case of like a cheetah and an antelope, these adaptations, on average, permit higher reproductive success than for individuals that don't. So if you're like a predator, you're going to be selecting for things like sharper claws, yes, better eyesight, yes, but remember, these are expensive traits. All right, number 3 is survival of the good enough. Survival of the good enough, not the fittest. I'm going to explain why in a second. Basically, the word fittest is a catch-all term that means how good you are at reproducing. It's not a particularly useful term. Really what matters in evolution is how often and how successfully you reproduce and make offspring that can also reproduce and make offspring. Some individuals do that very, very well, right? You could call them fittest if you wanted, but some individuals do it, but just not as well. So they're not as fit, but they're good enough. So this is why we call it survival of the good enough. As long as you're producing offspring, and that offspring can produce offspring and so on, you've passed kind of the evolutionary test. You are good enough, right? So survival of the good enough. Adaptations help. These are inherited characteristics, phenotypes that increase your chance of survival. So fast twitch muscle fibers, sharper claws, denser keratin for nails and for grabbing things, right? Better eyesight. The reflective lens in the back of a lot of organisms that have night vision, right? So you can have things like structural adaptations, right? Porcupine quills, etc. And then you can actually have things like behavioral adaptations, so migratory behaviors in birds to take advantage of local seasons and food resources and mating locations, right? That's a behavioral adaptation. Schooling in fishes is an anti-predatory behavior, right? There's safety in numbers here. Same thing with flocks of birds, etc. So variety of adaptations, but go ahead and take a look at this really quick. Ears, not necessarily just for hearing, but to actually help cool off. The blood vessels help dissipate heat. The sugar glider has, again, this is a great picture to look at. A lot of people think that anything less than a fully functional wing is useless evolutionarily, and this is a living example for how that's not the case, right? These are not full wings, but there's certainly adaptive value for these organisms, or flying squirrels, etc. Flying squirrels that that benefit from something less than what we would think of as a fully functional wing. So camouflage is an adaptation where you physically blend into your environment. Again, this is pretty straightforward. Here are all examples of camouflage. I think this top right one's pretty interesting. It's a seahorse, looks like kelp or seaweed. Mimicry is similar, but mimicry is specifically when you're copying the appearance of a dangerous organism. You're copying the appearance of an organism that's usually poisonous or dangerous to compete with. And in this case, the hoverfly copies the wasp, because the wasp is usually dangerous, whereas the fly is not. And again, it's not that the fly is deliberately doing this. It's not saying, hey, I need to look like this wasp so I don't get eaten. It's over time, flies that had similar coloration to the coloration of wasps were avoided more than than flies that stood out. Right? So over time, over many, many thousands of generations of flies, the flies that looked most like wasps were left alone, and they therefore reproduced more and had more offspring. And the key is that looking like a wasp was genetic, right? The genes that gave you the coloration were passed on from generation to generation over time. So this is what, again, we mean by natural selection being blind. There's no force or hive mind saying, I really need this color in my hoverflies so that they don't get eaten. There's nothing like that at all. There's no planning here. It's just natural selection. It's the differential reproductive and survival of individuals. As long as those traits are genetically determined or genetically influenced, they will get passed on and they will get modified over time by natural selection. So this is an example of mimicry. Here's another example of mimicry. So monarchs are poisonous to birds. They're toxic to birds. Viceroys are not, but in a similar mechanism, they look like monarchs. Same thing here with these snakes, and sometimes they're so good that you can't even pick them out. Try to go ahead and pick these out. I'll give you a second. You can even pause the video. Which two snakes are non-poisonous? Basically, which snake is the coral snake? Or which two are coral snakes and which one's not? Well, the answer is this one right here. These two, snake 1 and snake 3, are coral snakes. They're poisonous. Snake 2 is the imposter. It's mimicking it based on its coloration. You can actually tell because of the shape of its head. It's mimicking the color, not the head shape. So that's what gives it away. The last step here is descent with modification. Basically, we've been talking about this the whole time, but over long periods of time, as the environment changes, natural selection selects organisms with slightly different structures, niches, and characteristics. So over time, a member of a species now might look something different than a member of the same species in 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. And eventually, individuals can change so much so that eventually they perhaps even become different species. And we'll talk about the origin of species, how you get species, when we cover speciation next week. But one of the main driving factors that kind of prompts this change is that the environment is pretty much always changing. It might not change on a day-to-day basis too much. The weather will change, but the climate might not. But over tens of thousands of years, which is really too long for us to take note of in our very, very short lifetimes, the impact on species is certainly enough to cause this change. So what this all gets to, I'm going to talk about finches here for a second, is common descent. All organisms on this planet have a common ancestor. This is actually a family and group of finches that Darwin was looking at, genus of finches in the Galapagos. This data is mostly not fossil data because you can just collect this in real time, but you can also verify this using DNA data. Similar, these are two bird examples, but similar example for Hawaiian honeycreepers. They do all have a common ancestor from mainland North America. We'll talk about founder species later. Basically, it's when you have an island off the mainland and some birds, in this case, go to the island and others don't. I think I'm going to end up with some terms here. Yeah. All right, I'm just looking at the rest of the notes. So again, just to recap, natural selection acts on specific traits, specific phenotypes that ultimately change allele frequencies. Right? As long as these phenotypes, these traits are governed by genes, ultimately natural selection acts on the gene level. And we'll end talking about 3 types of selection, 3 types of natural selection in terms of how they change phenotypes. So here we go. The first is directional. Directional. So let's look at beak size. Right? Perhaps you have, and actually Darwin saw this, on the Galapagos, you have finches that have this kind of medium-sized beak, and there is a drought. And that drought decreases the insect population, but increases the number of hard, large seeds. Those seeds need bigger beaks, stronger muscles around the beaks in order to crack open, right? So there's a couple called the Grants. It's their last name. I forget. I think one of them was Rosemary. I think the other's name was Peter. I might be misremembering that, but their last name was Grant, which is actually my first name. But basically, within two or so decades, they were able to document this change, a shift in beaks from being smaller, thinner, more adapted for eating insects, to being thicker and larger, more adapted to eating dry seeds. So this kind of shift, where the average in this dashed line was probably around here, so we'll just say, I don't know, 10, that's just some kind of number. Now, after, again, about 2 or 3 decades in this case, let's say this is just 15, they saw an average beak size increase over time. So this is called directional selection. You're going in one direction. The trait in question is shifting in one direction to larger beaks or smaller beaks. And individuals kind of in this yellow portion that had larger beak size in the initial population, they had higher fitness. They had more offspring, their offspring reproduced, and so on and so on. Whereas individuals that had smaller beaks in the initial population had lower fitness. They died more often, they had less offspring. That's what's behind this shift in beak size. Stabilizing selection is when the average is favored. So this, think about like mice in this example. If you have kind of an average sized mouse, you have high fitness. If you're too big, if you have too much weight, then you perhaps can't navigate into smaller areas to hide. You're perhaps a little slower, and it's easier for snakes and birds to eat you. But if you're too small, if your birth weight is too light, then you might not have the fat resources or the energy to really self-sustain and wean off the mother, and you're more likely to die that way. So in that case, the best range is actually to be right in the middle rather than kind of on either side. So that's called stabilizing selection. And the last kind of selection here is disruptive selection. This is where the middle is bad, the average is bad. It has high mortality and low fitness. So this is, we'll go back to beak size. Let's say you have two conditions. You have either very dry conditions that require a hard, thick beak to crack open large seeds, or you have very wet conditions that have a high insect population, which is good for like a lot of soft berries and insects. A smaller beak is good for that. Whereas if you have like an intermediate sized beak, you're not really good at either. You're not really good at eating insects or getting small berries, and you're not good at cracking open larger nuts or seeds. So in this case, the extremes are rewarded. It's good to have a small beak, it's good to have a large beak, but having an intermediate beak is not so good. So it's kind of like the opposite of stabilizing selection. All right, I'll let you look at this on your own. This is just a cute little brief summary. I've talked quite enough. And I will leave you with some words here. So, big picture. Yes, we need to change our explanations. And we have modified natural selection over the past 200 years, 150-ish years since Darwin proposed it. But over all of that time, not once has natural selection ever been disproven. Not one study, not one serious line of inquiry has ever derailed this explanation. To the contrary, everything we've ever done, all the research we've ever done, all the data we've ever collected has supported this idea and just developed it even more. Our understanding, the scientific consensus behind natural selection is the same as our consensus that the Earth revolves around the sun. This is not an idea that we're unsure about. This is biology. Understanding this topic is synonymous with understanding biology. And on the right, all of these things, and this is just a small list, have come since Darwin's time. All of these lines of evidence Darwin never had: genetic and DNA, biochemical, additional fossil evidence, an entire new branch of biology called evolutionary development. evolutionary psychology, basically how evolution has impacted the way the human brain developed, which is actually what I went to my master's program for. Incredibly interesting stuff. Things like antibiotic resistance, which is fitting because we're in the middle of a pandemic. Even though COVID's not a bacteria, it evolves similarly to bacteria because it very quick mutation rates. Punctuated equilibrium, genetic drift, gene flow, kin selection, sexual selection, group selection, Hardy-Weinberg, which we'll end the unit on. All of these things have come out of evolutionary theory. So evolutionary theory is here to stay. It's the law of the land. It is biology. There's really no getting away from it. So maybe you will go on to be, evolutionary psychologists one day. I don't know. That would be my dream. But there are so many different fields to pursue in evolution. It's not just this kind of one-off in biology. It permeates everything we understand about life and the human brain and all this other stuff. So it's an excellent set of fields. Research these as you see fit. I highly encourage it. And we will talk about some of these actually in class next week and the weeks to come. So I hope this helped. I'm sorry it was a longer video, but it's one of my favorite topics, and I will see you in class.